Travel with me to a river valley in southeastern Turkey 11,000 years ago. There are no roads, no electricity, no cars or buildings. A woman, barefoot, wrapped in animal skin, kneels in the mud. In front of her, a flat stone, worn smooth in the middle from years of use. In her hands, a rounded grinding stone. Between them, a small pile of einkorn wheat, one of the oldest cultivated grains in human history. She is making flour. She doesn't know it yet, but what she is doing will change the world more than any war, any king, or any idea. The simple act of grinding this grass seed into powder, which makes it storable, portable, and ultimately tradable, is about to give rise to cities, which lead to armies to protect those cities, taxation to pay them, and the introduction of writing to keep track of it all. Essentially, everything we recognize as civilization. The seed didn't just feed us. The seed organized us. And today, we talk about what we've done with it since. I'm Zach Sykes. This is Eat or Die, Stories from the Human Table, a show from Renegade Health Group about the things we eat, the history behind them, and what the science actually says when the marketing gets out of the way. Each episode, we take one ingredient, a nutrient, food, or molecule, and we follow it through history, biology, and your daily life. Last episode, we talked about protein, the molecule that built the human body. Today we're talking about grains, the food that built human society. We're going to cover what grains actually are, how they remade the human world multiple times over across 10,000 years of history, what the professor has to say about what happens inside your body when you eat them, and perhaps most importantly, why the grain you're probably eating most is the one you'd be better off eating least. Let's go. A grain is, at its most basic, the seed of a grass. That's it. Thousands of years of agriculture, countless varieties, an entire section of every grocery store, all of it descends from the edible seeds of grasses. The grass family, Poaceae, is arguably the most consequential plant family in human history. Rice, wheat, corn, barley, oats, rye, sorghum, millet, all grasses, or more specifically, the seeds of grasses. Anatomically, a whole grain has three parts: the bran, or the outer layer, fibrous, nutrient-dense; the germ, which is the embryo of the seed. It's very rich in vitamins, minerals, healthy fats. And the endosperm, the starchy interior, which is essentially the seed's energy reserve, designed to fuel the embryo's growth. When you eat a whole grain, you get all three. When you eat a refined grain, like white flour, you get almost exclusively the endosperm. The bran and the germ have been stripped away. What's left is starch. Calories without context. We'll come back to why that matters. First, the story of how this seed conquered the world. The story begins around 10,000 BCE in the region known as the Fertile Crescent, a fittingly crescent-shaped arc of land stretching from modern Israel and Jordan, north through Lebanon and Syria, east through Turkey, and then down into Iraq and Iran. This is where wild einkorn wheat and wild barley grew in dense natural stands. And this is where, for the first time in human history, people began to deliberately plant, tend, and harvest them. Why here? Why now? The honest answer? We don't really know. Around 12,000 years ago, the last ice age ended, creating warmer, wetter conditions across this region. The wild grains became more abundant. Populations grew along with them, and at some point, likely gradually over generations, people made the transition from harvesting wild grains to planting them intentionally. The consequences were staggering. Agriculture allowed for the first time in human history the storage of food. You could harvest grain in summer and eat it in winter. You could accumulate surplus, and surplus changed everything. Most impactfully, it allowed some people to stop farming and do other things, to become priests, soldiers, administrators, craftspeople. It allowed specialization, which led to hierarchy, and hierarchy led to cities. The world's first cities, like Uruk and Jericho, were grain cities, built around the storage and distribution of agricultural surplus. Grain didn't just feed civilization, grain made civilization possible. Now fast forward 2,000 years. The Nile Valley. Egypt is the most dramatic example in history of a civilization built entirely around grain. The Nile flooded predictably every year, depositing rich silt across the floodplain, creating some of the most fertile agricultural land on Earth. The Egyptians used that predictability to plant emmer wheat and barley. They harvested enormous surpluses, and on the foundation of that surplus, they built one of the most enduring civilizations the world has ever seen. Speaking of building, the pyramids at Giza, they weren't built by slaves. They were built by paid workers, workers who were fed, according to the archaeological record, enormous quantities of bread and beer, both made from grain. The logistics of feeding tens of thousands of workers for decades required an intense grain management system of extraordinary sophistication. Egypt became, in the ancient Mediterranean world, what Saudi Arabia is to oil today, the dominant supplier of an essential resource that everyone else needed. Egyptian grain fed Rome. It fed Greece. Control of Egyptian grain was, for centuries, control of the ancient world's food supply. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BC, he understood immediately what was actually at stake. Egypt's grain was Rome's lifeline. Whoever controlled the Nile controlled the Mediterranean. Now, Rome deserves its own chapter in any history of grain, because Rome elevated grain distribution from an agricultural practice to a political instrument they then wielded with overwhelming economic power. Rome ruled and conquered almost more with grain than with their vaunted legions. The Roman grain dole, the frumentatio, began in 123 BC under the populist Gaius Gracchus in exchange for the masses' support. The Roman state would sell grain to citizens at subsidized prices. By the time of Julius Caesar, it had become free. At its peak, roughly 200,000 Roman citizens received free grain distributions every month. This was not charity. It was politics. The grain dole kept the urban poor of Rome fed and, crucially, manageable. It was the bread in bread and circuses, the phrase the poet Juvenal used to describe how the Roman government bought the compliance of its population. Rome's grain came from across the empire: Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, but above all Egypt. The logistical network required to move millions of tons of grain annually across the Mediterranean was one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world. And when that network began to fail, when droughts hit the grain provinces, when the empire's borders contracted and the administrative capacity to manage those supply chains deteriorated, Rome went hungry. Historians debate the causes of Rome's fall endlessly, but disruption of the grain supply is always somewhere on the list. Empires that cannot feed their capitals do not survive. So after Rome, Europe reorganized itself around grain in a completely different way: the feudal system. The medieval peasant's diet was monotonous to a degree that's almost impossible to imagine today. Bread, porridge, more bread. The grain changed by region: rye in northern Europe, wheat in the south and west, oats in Scotland and Ireland, millet and sorghum in parts of the Mediterranean, but the dependency was universal and total. The lord owned the land, the peasant farmed it. A portion of the harvest, often a third or more, went to the lord as rent, and what remained had to sustain a family through the year. When harvests failed, people starved. And that didn't happen occasionally. That happened regularly. Medieval Europe experienced significant famine events roughly once per generation. The mills, which ground grain into flour, were owned by the lords and the church, and peasants were legally required in many areas to use that lord's mill and pay them for the privilege. The control of grain processing was a mechanism of economic and political control as direct as any tax. This is the world that grain built: stratified, dependent, enormously productive by ancient standards, but deeply structurally unequal. Now, I want to spend a moment on Ireland in the 1840s, not only because it's a direct result of those feudal systems, but because it's one of history's most devastating illustrations of what happens when grain, and food in general, becomes political. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland experienced a catastrophic failure of the potato crop due to a water mold, and potatoes were the staple food of the Irish poor. Over the course of 7 years, approximately 1 million people die of starvation and disease. Another million emigrated. Ireland's population fell by 25% in less than a decade and has never recovered. Here's the part that doesn't make it into most textbooks. Throughout the famine, Ireland continued to export grain. Wheat, oats, and barley were shipped out of Irish ports to England while people starved in the Irish countryside. The grain was grown on land owned by English landlords. It was their property. And under the economic orthodoxies of the time, the British government largely declined to stop the exports or intervene meaningfully. The Irish famine was not simply a natural disaster. It was a grain policy catastrophe, a failure of political will as much as a failure of crops. The seed that could have saved lives was sailing away from the people who needed it, because the systems built around that grain, the ownership, the trade, the political economy, they decided that it should. This is the shadow side of the civilization grain built. It gave us cities and armies and libraries, but it also gave us the mechanisms to let 1 million people starve, while ships full of food left their ports. Now, the 20th century did two enormous things to grain simultaneously. It made more grain than the world had ever seen, and it made those grains significantly worse for you. The Green Revolution of the 1950s through 70s, which was driven by the agronomist Norman Borlaug, who won a Nobel Peace Prize for it, developed high-yield dwarf wheat varieties that transformed global agriculture. In India alone, wheat production more than doubled between 1965 and 1970. The Green Revolution is genuinely estimated to have saved 1 billion lives. But it also gave us modern wheat, a plant so thoroughly bred for yield, disease resistance, and milling that it bears relatively little resistance to the einkorn and emmer wheats of that Fertile Crescent we talked about. Modern wheat has a higher gluten content than its ancestors. Its proteins are structured differently. And because it was bred for the needs of industrial milling rather than human nutrition, the whole grain conversation became more urgent precisely as the world's wheat supply exploded. Industrial milling could strip the bran and germ from wheat with extraordinary efficiency, producing white flour that's shelf-stable, light-textured, and nutritionally hollow. White bread became default. The staff of life became refined starch. Enrichment programs, adding back a handful of B vitamins and iron, were introduced in the 40s as a public health response, but they don't really do much. This tells you everything you need to know. We stripped the nutrition out, caused deficiency diseases, and then added a fraction of it back and called it enriched. Today, the average American gets more of their daily calories from refined grains than from any other single food category. And the metabolic consequences of that, the blood sugar volatility, the insulin resistance, the obesity, they're playing out in real time across the population. We built civilization on this seed, and then we broke it. The professor is in, lab coat on. Let's talk about what a grain actually does inside your body, because it's more interesting than the bread aisle would suggest. So grains are primarily carbohydrates. The carbohydrate is a molecule made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The name literally means hydrated carbon. Simple carbohydrates are short chains, 1 or 2 sugar molecules. Complex carbohydrates are long chains, hundreds or even thousands of glucose molecules linked together. Starch is a complex carbohydrate, and it's what the endosperm of a grain is mostly made of. When you eat starch, your digestive system breaks those long chains back down into individual glucose molecules. That glucose enters your bloodstream, and your blood sugar rises. Your pancreas releases insulin, and insulin shuttles glucose into your cells to be used for energy, or stored as glycogen in your muscles and liver, or if those stores are full, converted to fat. This is not pathological. This is normal carbohydrate metabolism. The problem is not the mechanism. The problem is the speed. The glycemic index, or GI, is a measure of how quickly a food raises your blood glucose relative to pure glucose, which is set at 100. So high GI foods spike your blood sugar rapidly and sharply, whereas low GI foods raise it slowly and steadily. White bread, a GI of approximately 75. White rice also up there around 72. Whole grain bread is closer to 50, and lentils are down at 32. Why does this matter? Because the speed of the glucose hit determines the magnitude of the insulin response. A sharp spike in blood glucose triggers a sharp spike in insulin. And chronically elevated insulin, which is driven by a diet high in refined, high glycemic index carbohydrates, it leads over time to insulin resistance, a condition where your cells become less responsive to insulin's signal, requiring more and more of it to do the same job. Insulin resistance is the metabolic foundation that leads to type 2 diabetes, and it's strongly associated with obesity, cardiovascular disease, and a range of inflammatory conditions. Whole grains are lower on the glycemic index than refined grains for a very specific reason, and that reason is fiber. Now, the bran layer of a grain is where most of the dietary fiber lives. Fiber is a carbohydrate that human digestive enzymes cannot break down. It passes through the small intestine largely intact and reaches the colon, where gut bacteria ferment it, producing short-chain fatty acids that feed the cells of your colon lining, reduce inflammation, and support a healthy microbiome. But fiber does something else that matters enormously in the context of blood sugar. It slows digestion. Fiber physically impedes the enzymes that break starch into glucose. It slows gastric emptying, and it forms a viscous gel in your gut that reduces the rate of glucose absorption. Fiber is, in effect, a natural governor of the glycemic response. It turns a fast spike into a slow, steady rise. But when you refine a grain, when you remove the bran, you remove this governor. The starch is now exposed, unprotected, rapidly digestible. You've engineered a high glycemic index food out of what was, in whole form, a very moderate response. This is why the distinction between whole and refined grains is not a minor nutritional quibble. It is the difference between a food that works with your metabolic machinery and one that chronically stresses it. We can't talk about grains in 2026 without addressing gluten, so let's be direct. Gluten is a protein composite found in wheat, barley, and rye. It forms when two proteins, glutenin and gliadin, bond together in the presence of water. It's what gives bread dough its elasticity and bread its chewy texture. For people with celiac disease, roughly 1% of the population, gluten triggers an autoimmune response that damages the small intestinal lining. This is serious, real, and requires strict, lifelong avoidance. For the roughly 6% of people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, gluten or related wheat proteins may cause digestive discomfort, fatigue, or other symptoms without the autoimmune damage of celiac. But for everyone else, the other 93%, the evidence that gluten is harmful is not compelling. Many of the health improvements people attribute to going gluten-free are likely explained by something else, whether it's the reduction in refined carbohydrates that tends to accompany a gluten-free diet, the increased attention to food quality, or simply the placebo effect of a significant dietary change. That said, and this is important, even if you're in the 93%, there are good reasons to reduce modern wheat specifically, not because of gluten per se, but because of what modern wheat is and how it's typically consumed, as a refined, high glycemic index, nutritionally stripped starch. All right. Here's where we make this practical. The single most important thing I can tell you about grains is this: whole versus refined is not a preference, it's a dietary philosophy. It's a metabolic distinction with real, measurable consequences for your health over time. Refined grains spike blood sugar. They do so repeatedly, chronically, across decades of eating. And that chronic blood sugar volatility and the insulin resistance it produces underlie some of the most prevalent and preventable chronic diseases we face. That's not a controversial statement in the research literature. It's settled. So rule one is simple. If it's refined, it should be the exception, not the staple. Now, not all grains are created equal. Here's how I think about them, from best to worst, for most people. First, tier one, eat these freely. First, we have oats. Whole rolled or steel cut, but not instant. They're one of the best carbohydrate sources available, high in a specific soluble fiber called beta-glucan, which has extensive evidence for reducing LDL cholesterol and improving insulin sensitivity. Next, white rice. And yes, I know this surprises people, but it's worth separating from the refined grain conversation. It's low in fiber, but it's also low in phytates and anti-nutrients. It's highly digestible and relatively inert metabolically when compared to wheat. In active people with adequate muscle glycogen demands, white rice is a perfectly functional carbohydrate. It's not nutritionally rich, but it's also not the problem. And also in tier one, we have quinoa. Now, quinoa technically isn't a grass grain. It's a seed from a flowering plant, but it earns a spot at the top of any practical grain list. It's a complete protein, it's high fiber, very low glycemic index relatively speaking, gluten-free. If you're going to eat a grain-adjacent food, quinoa is hard to beat. Now, tier two, these are the ones you eat thoughtfully. Barley and rye, they're nutritionally excellent. High fiber, low glycemic index, good mineral content. The issue is, they're rarely consumed in genuinely whole form. Most commercial barley and rye products are processed to varying degrees. If you can find them whole, eat them. If you're getting them in commercial bread, check that label carefully. And corn. Whole corn, not the high fructose corn syrup it's been industrially converted into. It's a reasonable whole grain. Popcorn, in fact, is a whole grain and a reasonable snack. Tier 3 is where we want to minimize or at least avoid allowing to become a staple in our diet. Modern wheat. This is the honest conversation. I'm not telling you to never eat a piece of bread. I'm telling you that if wheat, specifically modern, refined wheat, is your primary carbohydrate source, that's worth reconsidering. Modern wheat has been bred for yield and milling efficiency, not nutritional quality. It has higher gluten content than ancient wheats. It's almost universally consumed in refined form, whether that's white flour, white bread, pasta, crackers, pastries. Even most commercial whole wheat bread is still primarily refined flour with a small percentage of bran added back. The combination of high glycemic index, low fiber, high gluten content, and the near ubiquity in the processed food supply makes modern wheat the grain most likely to be driving metabolic dysfunction in the Western diet. Not because wheat is uniquely evil, but because of what it's become, how it's processed, and how much of it we eat. If you want to eat wheat, eat it as sourdough. That long fermentation process significantly reduces the glycemic impact and partially breaks down gluten. Eat it as a genuine whole grain, not enriched, refined flour with a marketing label. And eat it as occasional food, not 3 times a day. So replace your default grain. If wheat bread is your everyday staple, swap it for oats at breakfast, rice at dinner. Experiment with quinoa as a base for your meals. You don't have to give up grain. You just have to choose better ones more often. Read the label. Whole grain on packaging is meaningful. Enriched flour or wheat flour without the word whole means refined. Multi-grain means nothing nutritionally. You can have multiple refined grains. Look for whole as the first ingredient. And consider your activity level. Grains are carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are primarily fuel. If you're active, genuinely training, moving daily, your body will use grain-derived glucose efficiently. If you're sedentary, your need for dense carbohydrate is significantly lower. Dose accordingly. And as always, if you have blood sugar regulation issues, metabolic syndrome, or type 2 diabetes, this is a conversation to have with your physician. The principles here are sound, but your specific clinical situation matters. We started this episode with a woman kneeling in the dirt in ancient Turkey, grinding einkorn wheat on a stone. She was doing something that would build Egypt, feed Rome, structure medieval Europe, and cause a famine in Ireland, eventually producing the bread aisle at your grocery store. The seed did not fail us. We failed the seed when we stripped it down to starch and called it food, when we industrialized it beyond recognition, and when we made it so cheap and so available that it became the invisible foundation of a diet driving chronic disease. The good news is that the seed itself, in its whole form, is still there. It's still what it always was. Still the same thing that fed the workers who built the pyramids. Eat it whole. Vary it. Don't let wheat be the only grain at your table. Eat accordingly. That's episode 2 of Eat or Die, Stories from the Human Table. I'm Zach Sykes, Renegade Health Group. If this episode made you think differently about something you eat every day, that's the whole point. Share it with someone who eats bread, which is everyone. A review goes a long way if you've got a minute, and if you want to go deeper on anything we've covered today, the glycemic index, the grain hierarchy, the history, find us on Instagram or Facebook at Renegade Health Group. Next episode, we're going underground. Something you can't see, can't taste, and almost certainly aren't getting enough of. It's everywhere in your body and almost nowhere in your diet. You'll want to be there. Until then, eat well.